afternoon. I hope this afternoon finds you in good spirits. I hope it finds you perhaps enjoying some time with family, even in the midst of a difficult and uncertain time. We find ourselves obviously facing a lot of, in many ways, unprecedented things. These are things that we've never dealt with before in terms of this pandemic, in terms of some of the lack of assembling time. I mean, this is something that stretching back nearly 100 years, we haven't dealt with in this in many ways. And so churches all around the country are trying to figure out what is the best way to handle this. How do we deal with assemblies? How do we deal with contacting members and all these things? And so as we were talking about that amongst our little group of elders and deacons and myself, we were talking about what is a way that we can try to engage with the members, engage with people, even though we might not be able to assemble together. What are some ways we can keep people focused on the right things? And so we talked about a variety of different ideas, but there was actually some pretty good response to having the sermon on YouTube. It seemed like there was a little bit more engagement than just a traditional audio recording. One person said it was nice to see your face. That's the first time I've ever been told that it was nice to see my face. Typically that's more of a, you see it on the passing by, you scream, and it's a reaction, but it's a negative reaction. So it was pleasant to hear that as a change of pace. And so we were talking about this, and it seems like we might be able to use some of these avenues of technology like YouTube to keep up with one another, to engage with one another, and maybe to think a little bit about spiritual things, even in the midst of a difficult time. And so one of the elders suggested that we use this opportunity to maybe do a short series of not really sermons, but more of little devotionals, just little videos that can help us get through the day and help us think on a spiritual idea. And we came up with the idea of looking through a specific list of attributes, the fruits of the Spirit, and thinking really, really specifically on how can we apply the fruits of the Spirits to us today in this time of pandemic. What are some ways that we can be living out the walk of the Spirit right now and really try to delve into some practicality of this? And so that's what we're going to do in this series of just real brief videos. Again, the intent of these is not to be a huge exegetical work, but really just a quick thought and a quick way for us to focus our minds, even in a time where we might not be able to assemble, still keep our minds on spiritual things, still feed ourselves these spiritual ideas. So if you'd like, you can turn with me to Galatians chapter 5, which is where we're going to be reading through this series of videos, looking specifically at verse 22 through 24, this list that is often we'll talk about the fruits of the Spirit. And so in context of this, Paul has been talking about the freedom that Christians have, and specifically the idea of using that freedom for the benefit of their walk with Christ, about the idea of not being shackled to the law, not being shackled to this old covenant system idea, the idea of being bound, really this misunderstanding of the old covenant, that it was all based off of possession of the law, it was all based off Judaistic rituals, but instead transforming the Galatians viewpoint and living a life centered on Christ-like attributes. And so Paul draws this contrast between the works of the flesh, things like strife, factions, dissensions, envying, carousing, and instead draws them to this list of very Christ-like attributes that will allow them to be godly in the way they walk. So let's go ahead and dive in and read through this verse. So in verse 22 of chapter 5, Paul says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. Now those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit." And so Paul gives us this really incredible list of attributes to consider. And so today we're just going to focus on the very first one, the idea of love. And love is one of those words that we talk about so often. So much to the point that I think sometimes we almost lose track of its value. We almost, it kind of flies by us, and we see the word love so often, and we think about the word love so often, and even in a secular sense, it's used so often that sometimes that word doesn't have the real weight that it does. And yet when Christ is asked, what is the entire epitome of the law? What do you see as the most important commandments? He says it's to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And he says on these two commandments, the entirety of the law and the prophets and the writing hinges. And so love is the centermost attribute of a Christian. That's why I think Paul lists it first here, is because if you don't have love, he says in another epistle, it's just a clanging cymbal. It's just a loud noise. It's worthlessness. Whatever you may be doing, if you don't do it with love, the rest of it's going to fall apart. And so the question we want to ask ourselves today, how can we demonstrate love, a biblical concept of love, in the midst of a pandemic? How do we demonstrate love where we are right now? And I think there's a lot of good answers for this. One of the ways is what we kind of talked about in our sermon on Sunday, which is the idea that we love people by being cautious. We love people by following the statutes and the advisories that are being set by our government. Certainly, I think there can be a sense of brashness, a sense of almost false bravado that comes with, well, I'm not worried about the virus, and I'm not worried about what it's going to do to me. And there's some commendability to that. Certainly, we shouldn't fear death. We shouldn't fear any sort of mortal disease. But there is a care for others that should come, particularly when a disease targets our elderly. One of the things that is most important in the Ten Commandments is the idea of honor thy father and thy mother. And Jesus says that's actually the first commandment with a promise, that it's so important that God ties the well-being of the land to the idea of honoring your father and your mother. Now, think about that just for a brief moment. Remember who Moses is giving that commandment to. It's not like he said for a brief moment, okay, we've gone through these commandments. Now to you children, here's your commandment. He's speaking to the same adult audience. And so when he's talking about that idea of honoring your father and mother, certainly there is contained in that the idea of the parent-child relationship, but it's also talking about the idea of upholding the elderly, about supporting and nurturing the elderly in their advanced years, that you are to honor them for the sacrifices they have made in raising us. And so particularly in a disease that strikes our most elderly, that targets those who are most weak and most affected by this, we have an obligation to be very cautious about this. And so we can show our love by being careful, by being cautious about things, by washing our hands, by not exposing ourselves unnecessarily, not going out when we might not need to. All of those may seem like very secular things, but we can view those through a biblical lens of wanting to care and wanting to protect the elderly and the immunocompromised in our community. So that's certainly one way we can do that. Another way we can do that is by making sure we check up on one another, by making sure we don't let the bonds of fellowship break during this time just because we may be physically isolated. In fact, Paul continues to talk in the book of Galatians, just a few verses down, in verse 1 of chapter 6. He says, "Brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so that you too will not be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself." Now, when we talk about this idea of loving one another and keeping in contact with one another, a lot of times we're thinking in a very physical manifestation. And certainly in a time of pandemic, that's a good thing to be doing. We want to make sure that we're checking on groceries. We want to make sure we're checking on, do people have enough money to get through these times? We want to check on, are people physically lonely or physically feeling frustrated? But even more important than that, more crucial than that physical necessities, is the spiritual necessities. Are we talking about the temptations we may face when we're isolated? Right now, we may find ourselves in a precarious situation where we may not be able to assemble for some extended amount of time. We may feel very isolated from our Christian brothers and sisters, and that can be a really dangerous place spiritually. And so we as Christians need to be talking to one another, not just about, are you physically doing okay, but are you spiritually doing okay? And that involves asking some questions that sometimes are kind of difficult and sometimes kind of awkward to ask. It's asking, are you facing temptation right now? Whatever temptation may be, whether it's sexual temptation, the temptation to despair, the temptation for drugs or alcohol, the temptation for so many different kinds of sins, what are you struggling with right now? And how can I help you? Can I get somebody else to help you in that capacity? It's asking somebody not just, how are you doing, but hey, what's discouraging you right now? What are your anxieties and fears right now? can I pray with you about those things? We're going to do a really good job, and I have full confidence we're going to do a great job checking in to make sure we've all got groceries. But are we also going to do a great job of checking to see if we're praying with one another? Are we doing a good job of checking to see if we're in the scriptures with one another? Are we talking to each other about the spiritual things that we're doing? Hey, did you see this sermon that was shared? Did you read the article that was on here? Hey, have you seen what this other congregation is doing? What can we be doing to enrich each other's lives? What can we be doing to lift one another up? Those conversations are just as important as the conversations about physical necessities. And so when we're talking about love being a fruit of a spirit, that comes as more than just physical love. It means spiritual love and concern for our souls. And so as we're going about our daily activities, we're checking in with one another, as we're making sure we're doing good, we need to see how we're doing spiritually. We need to ask, are you facing temptation? Are you struggling with something? Do you have questions right now? Are you wondering, where is God in all of this? Are you facing doubts? Are you facing questions in your belief? Those are awkward conversations, and frankly, they're harder than a conversation of, do you have enough milk? But that doesn't mean they're not important conversations to have. So we need to be spiritually checking in on one another, just as we're physically checking in on one another. And then the last thing, we talked a little bit about this on Sunday, but are we shining our light for our neighbors? There are so many people in the community that we can be reaching right now, that we can be showing our light, that we can showing our love. I've seen so many examples of people posting little sticky notes on people's doors of saying, hey, if there's anything you can do, call me. If there's anything you'd like to pray about, let's do so. I actually was really encouraged today as I walked out to come to the office. I saw somebody had left chalk on our front doorstep, chalk in a little note. And the note said, hey, let's all get out and draw something on our sidewalks. Let our kids do something and draw a Bible verse or draw a happy picture. Draw something so that then tomorrow when we all go walk and we all get out of our house, we can all be really encouraged by what we see with one another. That is a brilliant idea. I mean, it just was a wonderful thing. It's one of those things I wish I had thought of it. But it was such an easy way to encourage each other, to remind each other that there's a sense of community, a sense of togetherness, a sense of we're all here in the same position. Let's make the best of it. That's the attitude that we need to exhibit in this time of pandemic, in this time of worry, is an attitude of Christian love for one another. So there's many different ways that we can be doing this. We can be demonstrating our love through our health habits, through our care for the elderly. We can be demonstrating our love through spiritually checking in on one another. And we can be demonstrating our love through our sense of community, through our sense of being good neighbors and being part of our groups of people. And so hopefully this is of help to you. I encourage you to think on your own ways of how you can be demonstrating love. Share that amongst ourselves. Let's talk about this as Christians and as members of the church. How can we be loving each other in this time of crisis? And I think as we go through these fruits of the Spirit, what we may find is that this time period of isolation and meditation, it may be really beneficial for us spiritually, that we may have some time to really hone in, really focus, and really think about what's the best way that we can serve God. I pray we take advantage of this time. I pray that no matter what may come in the coming weeks, that we continue to serve God and we continue to look for ways to serve God as effectively as we can. I pray this was beneficial to you. If there's any feedback or anything, certainly let me know. Shoot me an email, shoot me a text message. But let's continue to be in conversation with each other. Let's continue to love one another. Let's continue to glorify God in all that we do. Thank you guys so much. We love you. We hope to see you again soon.